We usually picture the end of the world arriving loudly. We imagine cities burning, armies crossing borders, or sudden destruction. But the darkest period in human history had no explosions. In the year 536, people simply woke up and went to work. There was no single moment, no war, and no invasion they could point to as the start of a disaster. The trigger happened high above them. Massive volcanic eruptions, likely starting in Iceland, pumped enormous volumes of ash into the upper atmosphere, blanketing much of the northern hemisphere in a thick gray veil. The sun still rose, but the light felt wrong. It appeared pale and weak. Daylight turned into a permanent dusk, and within months, global temperatures plummeted. This raises a difficult question. How do you recognize a collapse when nothing explodes? Facing a sky that had stopped working, people didn't panic. They followed their daily routines and waited for the warmth to return. At the time, staying the course seemed like the only logical response. The environmental toll hit almost immediately. Summer brought snowstorms instead of heat. Wheat rotted in European fields, fruit trees produced nothing, and the basic rhythm of the seasons completely unraveled. We can visualize this through the lens of normalcy bias. When faced with severe disruption, our psychology often defaults to a dangerous assumption. Even as the foundational pillars of a society dissolve, we tend to focus on the outer frame, the markets, the laws, and the leaders that still appear intact. You can see this in the historical record. Farmers and citizens watched their harvests fail in 536, and they believed the next year would fix it. Then they banked on the season after that. They kept applying the same expectations to a system that could no longer support them. To the people of the 6th century, waiting felt measured and civilized. It felt intelligent to delay abandoning their land or altering how they lived. But waiting doesn't preserve strength. It actively consumes the exact resources you need to survive. The initial shock is rarely the true danger of a crisis. Instead, the threat hides in the comfort of routine. If we wait for the surface to crack before we act, we might miss the moment when the system underneath has already failed. As the years dragged on, the physical toll began to compound quietly. Food portions shrank. In desperation, communities made the dangerous choice to eat their seed reserves rather than planting them, trading future survival for a few extra days of calories. This prolonged starvation triggered a biological crash. Years of living in the cold with empty stomachs entirely decimated the population's immune systems. Minor illnesses that people would typically brush off suddenly became lethal. Social trust dissolved right alongside their health. Sharing disappeared. Credit vanished. At first, parents skipped meals so their children could eat, and eventually, the children had to skip meals too. What do you fight when the enemy has no face? What is uniquely terrifying about this period is the total lack of violence. These communities didn't burn down in chaotic riots. They simply thinned out. Homes stood abandoned, and entire villages vanished from the historical record in total silence. This quiet disappearance created a cascading labor shortage. Farmers lacked the energy to farm. Soldiers couldn't defend borders. Tax collectors went door to door, only to find empty houses. By the late 530s, the world had entirely exhausted itself. Society wasn't falling to a foreign enemy. Its internal systems were simply breaking down under the weight of sustained malnutrition. This graph illustrates the reality of the year 540. What looked like a surviving civilization was actually just exhaustion pretending to be stability. While the perception of the state remained relatively high, their actual systemic resilience had quietly dropped to zero. Then, in 541, an invisible enemy traveled along the trade routes. Ships arriving in ports carried a deadly bacteria, the start of what we now call the Plague of Justinian. The disease spread uncontrollably through dense urban centers. In Constantinople alone, thousands died every single day. The streets filled with the sick, and the city's burial systems completely collapsed under the sheer volume of corpses. The reason this plague was so lethal is that it struck a population entirely stripped of biological defense. The victims who caught it had spent the last 5 years starving in the cold, waiting for a harvest that never came. The historical reality is clear. The plague did not cause the collapse of this era. It merely finished off a society that had already drained its own strength through years of inaction. Major powers like the Eastern Roman Empire technically survived the decade, projecting an outward facade of imperial strength. But internally, they were permanently broken, entering a long, irreversible decline. This period quietly redirected world history. It didn't destroy these empires overnight. It slowly bled their momentum, their economic power, and territorial reach over generations. We often confuse pure endurance with resilience. Lowering your expectations, accepting less food, and enduring hardship without actively recovering is not strength. It is a state of slow depletion. Societal collapse rarely happens through sudden disaster. It happens through delayed recognition. When conditions permanently worsen, staying calm and waiting for clarity is the exact trap that turns a crisis into a collapse.